Hello and greetings from the headquarters of the International Energy Forum, the global home of energy dialogue. My name is Tom Ashby. I'm the head of global communications. The topic of this 90-minute webinar is copper mining and vehicle electrification. It's being live streamed on the IEF website, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and X. So welcome to everybody watching online. Secretary General of the IEF, Joseph McMoneagle, will bookend today's webinar with opening and closing remarks, while Professor Adam Simon will moderate the panel. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Joseph McMoneagle, Secretary General of the International Energy Forum.
Well, thank you, Tom, and welcome. Let me add my welcome to everybody joining us live and hopefully joining us on the recording when it's posted later. I'd also like to thank the authors of the report, Professors Adam Simon and Larry Cathles. I think they've presented a very important report on a very timely topic that is really not just critical to the energy transition, but also to theories about peak oil. So I think it's a very consequential report, and we're very pleased at the IEF to be presenting it. To those who may not be familiar, the IEF is 30 years old. It's the producer-consumer dialogue organization. We're also increasingly the developed and developing world dialogue organization. And one of our main focuses is energy security. And normally that's viewed through the prism of oil and gas, but I think increasingly today it's viewed also with regards to critical minerals. And I think we're going to shed some light on one of those critical minerals today with this webinar and with our report. As I've said many times, the transition is not easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. The IEF produced a report last year with S&P Global called the Global Energy Solutions Initiative, or shorthand is GESI. And the main conclusion of that report was that there isn't going to be a linear one-size-fits-all transition. That view that was professed maybe 3 or 4 years ago was really outdated and actually very misguided policy. Instead, there's going to be a multi-dimensional transition that different countries will be able to rely on different resources and different starting points while still maintaining their view on the energy transition. I'll let the authors speak more to the topic and also to our panelists who are joining us today. I want to welcome them. But I'll just say this, there does seem to be in the discussion about the transition and electric vehicles and even this topic of peak oil, sort of a presumption that the needed copper for the green transition is going to be available. And I think this report points out the reality of the situation, that it's really not, well, let's just say that it's more challenging than I think people have been led to believe up until this point. That's not to say that the electric vehicles industry won't continue to thrive based on product choices and consumer preferences. If you've driven one, you know what an amazing car EVs are. But I'll turn it over now to Professor Adam Simon, who will guide us through the presentation of the report and then also the panel discussion. But let me again thank you, professors, for your hard work, and also to the panelists joining us today for the discussion. So Adam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. My name is Adam Simon. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and my scholarly work focuses on the global flow of critical energy minerals. I've spent about 20 years focused on copper and other minerals that we now know are vital to the energy transition, and also development and capacity building for the several billion people around the world who need electricity and clean water and all of the things that we tend to take for granted in the United States and other more developed countries. So before we review the report, I'd like for each of our panelists just to give an introduction, who you are and what your role is with your current company. And I'll start with Nicole.
Thanks very much, Adam. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Januzak, and I'm Practice Lead Predictive Capability at BHP. In this role, I guide global teams across a range of commodities to be disruptive in how we predict and discover the world-class resources that the world needs. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, Nicole. Dan?
Hi, this is Dan Kravitz. I'm a Corporate Development and Exploration Vice President at Freeport-McMoRan. We're a global leader in copper production, and looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Frank?
Sure. I'm Frank Hoffman. I'm an Associate Director of Consulting at S&P Global Market Intelligence. I work on a lot of thought leadership around supply chain, minerals, and the energy transition, including a couple of our recent studies, the future of copper and the impact of the IRA on North American mineral markets.
Saskia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Saskia Diveston. I am the Chief Advisor for Research and Development with the Copper Product Group with Rio Tinto. That means I get to work in the very exciting space of technology development for everything from underground mining, surface mining, processing, tailings, and even a little bit of digital. So very passionate to get to talk about this topic with this panel today.
Tommy?
Hi, my name is Tommy Horton. I'm Director of Investor Relations and Corporate Development at Ivanhoe Mines. Ivanhoe discovered the Kamoa and Kakula deposits back in 2008 and 2015, and we've been in production since 2021, and we are soon to be the third, fourth largest copper mine in the world.
And last but not least, Larry.
Well, I'm let's see, I've had the privilege of being engaged in resource industry for a good long time. I started out at Kennecott Copper back when Kennecott was its own company before it was taken over by BP and then Rio Tinto and goodness knows who, everybody else. I also worked for Chevron for about 5 years and got interested in oil and gas and how basins behave. And there's an awful lot of commonality between how these resources are formed. It's all related to fluid flow and mass transport of metals and how they get dissolved and precipitated. And it tells us an awful lot about Earth history. So thank you very much to the IEF for hosting this, and thank you all for being on the panel. I'm going to be very interested in hearing what you have to say.
So with those introductions, I'm going to share my screen now, and Larry is going to walk our audience through a sequence of slides that highlight the key results of our study. And I'll provide a quick summary here for what we hope you take away from the study, which is that it's the first study that quantitatively models future mine production of copper using historical data for the period 1900 to 2018. And what we've done in the study is we have mathematically determined the amounts of copper needed for a variety of renewable energy scenarios, vehicle electrification, electrification of our power infrastructure, and we then contextualize the results in terms of how many more new copper mines will we need to ensure that the energy transition and capacity building can occur. So, give me 1 second, Larry. And then I'll just remind our audience as well that as of today, if you go to the IEF's website, you can download the full report. But Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Adam, and thanks again to everybody. It's my privilege to review the report, and the first thing to say is it's not new. Those engaged in the resource business are well aware of everything stated in it, but the policymakers seem only partly aware, and the general public is nearly completely unaware. The report is therefore intended to encourage the discussion among the broader public that is needed to formulate resource-realistic transition policies. To this end, the report focuses on copper, the metal most essential to the planned electrical transition. The report is short. It consists of 1 figure and 7 pages of discussion, supported by 15 pages of supplemental material, presenting all data and methods. The report is empirical. Conclusions are based on historical trends, and the report incorporates input from over 20 of our colleagues in government, academia, exploration, and mining. So this next slide, Adam, can you, yeah. Both of the panels shown plot mine or refinery production of copper in millions of tons of copper per year on the y-axis as a function of calendar year time on the x-axis. In panel A, the orange curve on the lower left shows the historical mine production from 1900 to 2022. The teal curve is an M. King Hubbard style projection of future copper mine production that is inferred from the shape of the historical mining curve and copper production in 1900 and 2018. It is a business as usual projection of past trends. It does not include copper demand from our future extra copper demand related to zero emissions transition. Following along this curve, the black dashed portion indicates that between 2018 and 2050, global copper mine output will increase from 20.4 to 37.1 million tons per year, growing at an annual rate of 1.9% per year. In this 32-year interval, 115% more copper will be mined than in all of history up to 2018. The total copper resource mineable with current technology is 6,598 million tons, which is the turquoise number on the bottom right. The 1,689 million tons that will have been mined in 2050 represents 26% of this total resource. The copper mine output, the teal curve, is not the total copper supply because recycled copper contributes to refinery output. The top black curve shows the refinery output. It peaks at an output of 65.7 million tons per year in 2086. It assumes that the contribution of recycled copper to refineries continues to grow at 0.5% per year until it reaches 35% in 2050. Recycling was 20% of refinery output in 2018. A 35% contribution represents 75% recycling, which is considered an upper limit. The black dashed portion of the refinery output curve is coincident with S&P Global's projection of business as usual copper demand over this period. Next slide. The right panel zooms in on the mine production between 2010 and 2060. The solid black curve labeled baseline corresponds to the black dash portion of the teal mine production curve in the left panel. It represents the mining needed to satisfy S&P Global's projected non-transition copper demand. The baseline increase mostly allows the developing world to catch up with the developed world. In 2022, developing countries consumed 74% of refined copper output. The gap between the orange hybrid curve and the black baseline curve is the amount of copper, additional copper, that must be mined to manufacture 100% hybrid vehicles rather than internal combustion vehicles. The gap between the dark blue EV curve and the baseline is the mined copper needed to manufacture electric instead of internal combustion vehicles. The light blue curve shows the additional copper needed to upgrade the business as usual electric grid for electric vehicles, according to S&P Global. The gap between the green curve and the baseline indicates the copper that wind and solar will need to replace fossil fuels by 2050. The copper is needed almost entirely for electrical transmission and distribution. 2/3 manages power variability. The gap between these curves that we've just discussed and the black dashed horizontal extension of the 20.4 million ton mine production in 2018 represents the production from new mines that is needed by the various scenarios. We will cast this additional mining in terms of the number of El Teniente mines that must be put into production each year to satisfy demand. Chile's El Teniente mine is chosen as our poster child because it produces at a rate that equals the average production of the top 10 currently producing mines, the ATTM. The next slide. The El Teniente mine is shown on the left. Staying on the business as usual baseline requires putting into production 1.1 El Teniente mines each year for the next 32 years. Next slide. 100% hybrid manufacture requires 1.2 El Teniente mines over the next 32 years. In 2050, there will be then 37 new El Teniente mines operating. The next slide. 100% electric vehicle manufacture requires 1.7 ATTM per year and 54 new El Teniente mines in 2050. And finally, replacing fossil fuels by wind and solar by 2050 requires 6 ATTM per year, or 194 new El Teniente mines in production by 2050, 32 years from now. El Teniente sized mines take 20 years or more to discover, permit, and put into production. Suarez from S&P Global has examined the development pipeline, including mine closures. His brown dashed curves show the number of potential mines in the pipeline will not meet even the business as usual baseline needs after about 2030. Returning to the bottom left panel, we see that it has been historically hard to depart substantially from the teal mine output curve. This is because a mine output shortfall causes prices of copper to rise, which is a powerful incentive to increase production. Conversely, a mine output excess causes copper prices and production to fall. Failure to meet the baseline demand, as suggested by the Suarez curves, will thus increase copper price and reduce demand. Development will be inhibited, especially in less prosperous regions. The Suarez challenge is severe and unlikely to be solved by small adjustments. For example, Freeport McMoran expects to produce 1/5 of the El Teniente output by leaching already mined material. If 5 companies did this, the increase in business as usual demand would be satisfied for 1 year without opening a new mine. But to do this for a second year would require twice the leaching, and a third year, 3 times the leaching, etc. There would be substantial environmental cleanup benefits from this, but the only way to meet the new business as usual demand, much less the transition demands, will be to open new mines. Next slide. There are several reasons for optimism. First, we have stayed on the business as usual curve for 120 years and can expect to remain on it. Resources exist at depths greater than 500 meters, which can be block caved, remotely mined, and refilled during mining, increasing safety and reducing environmental impact. In the long run, copper could be mined from the oceans. However, in the short term, there are major challenges to supplying the copper needed for even a business as usual future, much less the 55% more production needed, more new production needed for electric vehicle manufacture. Policy goals need to be modified. Some obvious suggestions include a goal of 100% hybrid rather than EV manufacture by 2035, transitioning to zero carbon emissions with hydro, nuclear, or green hydrogen rather than wind and solar electricity transmission, acceleration of responsible mining, promotion of deep exploration and mining, preparation for responsible ocean mining. In closing, I'd like to emphasize again that Adams and my report is intended to promote discussion. The rest of this seminar will be a start at that discussion by an expert group actively engaged in copper mining and fully aware of the issues we have raised. Adam will now solicit their thoughts and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Larry. Excellent introduction and overview of the report. So I'd like to lead off with a question for Tommy. One of the things that we hear frequently in the news is that it's becoming harder and harder for mining companies to discover new ore deposits. Can you give us a sense of what the challenges are for the discovery of new deposits?
Yeah, of course. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Larry and Adam for a very well-written report. It does a fantastic job of explaining this very interesting situation that we find ourselves in the copper market right now. This is sort of a once-in-a-generational squeeze that we don't really see any easy way out or sort of silver bullets. And really, the fundamental issue comes down to the lack of supply. Other than recycling of scrap, supply comes from exploration. Supply doesn't come from M&A. The M&A that is going on in the market at the moment, all it does is just reduces the number of hands that hold that copper supply. It doesn't create any more copper supply. So yeah, as we deplete mines, we need to find more ore deposits to replace them. So why are ore deposits becoming harder to find? Yeah, great question. So let's start with some data. So I have actually here's what I prepared earlier. So I did actually look back and I used S&P data for this. Over the last 30 years, the number of copper discoveries that have occurred. And I bunched this up into 5-year increments just for the purpose of clearly explaining this. So between 1995 and 1999, there were 64 copper discoveries made. Between 2000 and 2005, there were 44 copper discoveries. And between 2005 and 2009, there were 51 copper discoveries. So, this is the sort of the rate of discovery that is required going forward in order to match what essentially the findings from Larry and Adam's report. But this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So between 2010 and 2014, there were 15 copper discoveries. Between 2015 and 2019, there were 2. By the way, both those were Ivanhoe mines. And between 2020 and today, there's been 2. So there's been a significant decrease in the number of copper discoveries, and that is really set us up for the situation that we're in, as per Adam and Larry's report. So why are copper discoveries harder to come by? Well, other than the usual response to this question that grades are declining, the head grade 20 years ago was around 1%. It's now 0.6%. Copper discoveries are harder to, deposits are harder to find. But I think really the big change over this time period is actually exploration spend. If you throw money at a problem, typically you find a solution. You know, who invests in exploration? You've got mining companies and you've got sort of junior exploration companies. And over the past decade, and this is not adjusted for inflation, you've seen a halving in the exploration spend across both those categories. And that basically means that investors are not rewarding mining companies, whether they be producers or juniors, for investing in exploration. So, you know, or growth. So why not invest in growth? You know, quite simply, it's a risky business. And these are the decisions that factor on where money gets channeled through a business. So, okay, so you've got multiple risks in a mining business. You've got exploration risk. Okay, it takes a long time, takes a lot of money, sometimes a lot of patience, and often there's a bit of luck involved. Permitting risk, deposits can be in sensitive jurisdictions, protected areas, there can be incumbent populations, development risk, even though you may have found something, it may not necessarily be economic. You know, after all, we are in a business to make money. And so, you know, there's some data that was included in your report that mentioned there's an abundance of copper according to USGS, but actually a lot of that is locked up, I'm assuming. I mean, it seems like a very large number, but a lot of that is locked up within, you know, issues with permitting, development risk, and then construction risk. You know, you as a company or as an investor, you've got to put money to build these projects, and many have proven, especially over the last decade or so, to be, you know, over budget and be late. You know, and mining projects are not cheap projects to build. So there's a lot of risk, and you can see why investors don't like it. So, you know, I've heard from a mining CEO that, you know, yes, there is more copper that is required to meet this energy transition, but it's not necessarily in their wheelhouse to find more of it. It's in their, you know, best interest to keep mining the you know, the assets that they have, and over time the price will go up, which is what is happening at the moment. So yeah, there's a factor in this that also comes down to incentive price. So if the price of copper ends up being very high, then your risk reward changes. But I don't think we've been anywhere near that incentive price for a long period of time. You know, we hit all-time highs today in the copper market, but I don't think really I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of incentive prices for you know, the next round of projects. And you know, the metals markets can be quite volatile. Making that strategic decision in a company does require a bit of stability in price and yeah, etc. So yeah, so why are copper discoveries harder to find? It's because basically we've spent the last decade not looking for them, and as a result, we are now in this sort of existential crisis where there is a growing physical shortage over the remainder of this decade, and there's actually no feasible, you know, solution to it that fills this void. You know, the report says that we need between 1 and 2 tier 1 mines, and you know, to your point, you used El Tente. You know, that's a tier 1 mine producing over 400,000 tons per annum of copper. You know, that is a very large operation. In fact, you included a screenshot on it. If you need, you know, 1 or 2 of those coming on per year, you know, that is a huge problem that requires a significant amount of capital that needs to be incentivized in order to take that risk. And although I talked about copper discoveries, when we talk about tier 1 mines, that's also a very different factor, right? Since 2000, there's only been 2 tier 1 mines that have been brought into production. That is Antamina and Kamoa-Kakula.
Wow. So economics clearly play a huge role in guiding mining companies' decisions to conduct exploration campaigns. And this is a great transition to Nicole. You know, speaking through the lens of BHP and what you're doing in the mineral exploration space, what are the challenges? Is it that we're just not spending enough money? Are we not developing new exploration methods that are needed to search for deeper deposits? Can you give us a sense of, you know, what needs to be done to improve exploration rates and discoveries?
Thanks, Adam. That's an excellent question and a really big one too. And at BHP, we certainly feel the urgency to discover and deliver new resources to the world, as you and Larry have highlighted, is absolutely essential. And I'm fortunate to build on what Tommy just shared regarding the rate of discovery, exploration, risks, spend, and the scale of the challenge. So to jump to the punchline, I think we essentially need 3 things to tackle our current challenge in exploration. The first is we need disruption to find new search space and define the technology that we need. Secondly, we need to disrupt ourselves and our typical ways of working with high impact and agile research, and also by looking to adjacent and perhaps some not so adjacent industries for help. And then lastly, I think we have to think a little bit differently about the economics of exploration and how and where we invest. So just speaking to that first point on disruption to find new search space and defining the technology we need to deliver, as an industry, as Tommy highlighted, we've been pretty good at finding mineralization out there, although it's been declining, but not good at finding mines. The majority of resources that we found are outcrop at or near surface. Future discoveries, as you've highlighted, are going to be undercover or in regions of complexity that will require us to get a lot better at predicting where to find them, because tripping over them isn't an option anymore. And our traditional toolkit isn't terribly effective when we start to look undercover. On the plus side, this means that there's considerable potential to find large systems, even in relatively mature places that might come to mind, like Australia, for example. But moving undercover and to greater depths is indeed challenging. We're finding metals and minerals in the ground, but the proportion that are being converted to mines, and especially those tier 1 and those high quality larger mines in terms of grade and tonnage, those that can survive price swings, for example, are flatlining. So we're not finding the mineable resources we need, and nowhere near the quantum, as you've highlighted, needed to support the energy transition. So it's a quality gap problem, and we need to figure out a way to disrupt that. One way to do this technically is using mineral systems to open up new search space. So, and with a specific focus on quality systems. So new search space doesn't necessarily just mean new countries. It could also be opening up areas in known regions, like undercover, or with new data that highlights new potential belts, like we saw in Ecuador with Cascabel, or recognizing that we have similar processes happening, but in different host rocks, like we saw at Ivanhoe's Kamoa-Kakula in the DRC. So it's thinking a little bit differently about how these systems set up, how these big resources are formed. So a combination of bottoms-up mineral systems thinking to figure out where these large systems and these resources have developed on the Earth and over the last few billion years, with the help of machine learning and artificial intelligence pointed at large data lakes. In the case of BHP, leveraging the legacy data generated over the last 100 years of exploration at BHP, not to mention the proliferation of open source and pre-competitive data that's now at our fingertips, will indeed create new insights and open up new search space. And so at BHP, for example, we're prioritizing strategic partnerships with global companies like AWS to collaborate and pilot different artificial intelligence approaches. And not only has this improved our accuracy, it means that what used to take us weeks to do can be done in a matter of seconds. So that's going to help to shorten that timeline to delivery. As I've highlighted, our exploration toolkit that we have right now is highly geared for near surface exploration, and we need to adapt. And as Tommy mentioned, access to ground is a real challenge too. So we need more remote means to conduct exploration, not just for prediction, but the technology and the tools to not only predict and detect at depth, but also sometimes at a distance. So we're also partnering to test new technology, like Ivanhoe Electric's recent announcement for an exploration alliance with BHP to accelerate the search for copper in the US, giving us access to their Typhoon geophysical survey system and the associated inversion software. So we got to try some new things. The second point I made was on disrupting ourselves and our typical ways of working, thinking about how we do research and how we look at adjacent and not so adjacent industries. And for us, research really has to be extremely targeted. So we do seek the help of the best in the world with research, but it has to focus on finding at the earliest point possible indications that these resources are capable of hosting high grades to provide the required return on investment that Tommy spoke about. And so we acquire new data sets, models, tools, and workflows, and we test them in flight for rapid adoption and application so it can make a difference. Similarly, the search for a COVID vaccine for me is a great example of how an entire industry and its players, both large and small, had to turn on a dime to deliver what the world required, both by looking in its archive and leveraging what was already in place, and also challenging the processes and the pipelines to deliver. And we absolutely have to do something similar. There's an extremely rich ecosystem of startups and innovators ready to deploy to our pressing problems. And indeed, we're working with those groups here at BHP to address some of our grassroots exploration challenges. And I think we also have to think differently about how and where we compete as an industry. So the timelines to discovery need to be dramatically reduced, and we all have to move to an increasingly data-driven world. So at BHP, we can envision a data ecosystem whose foundation, for example, is a standards-based, centralized, cloud-based repository for the mining industry as a whole, where governments and research partners make data and metadata and codes and workflows publicly available. We could collectively lower the bar to entry and enable access to standardized data, workflows, and applications to industry players, both big and small, on a repository like that. We don't have to compete in how we structure data or pre-competitive data or research data. Software providers might want to develop apps and make them available in an open source platform. I know some of the best geophysical inversion software we use to help identify targets for exploration have improved dramatically thanks to them being open source codes. And I think these new ways of working will really entice people to our industry. We need extremely skilled geoscientists who are open to new ways of working. New skill sets like artificial intelligence and machine learning are core disciplines now, and new technology. We need these boundary spanners and lateral thinkers, and they're becoming harder to find. Geoscience departments are disappearing across the globe, and those that remain have precipitously low enrollment rates. And for us in exploration, data and people are all we've got. They're our only assets in exploration. So if we're not harvesting the maximum value out of our data, and if we're not transitioning our people from being data gatherers to knowledge workers, we've got a serious problem. And then, of course, there's the face of the mining industry. We are currently seen as a big part of the problem, when in fact, we play such a critical role in decarbonizing the globe. The mining industry, as you've highlighted, is absolutely essential to this challenge. So by communicating that we're part of the solution, bringing in the latest tools, artificial intelligence technologies, freeing our geoscientists and others that we work with from some of the mundane compiling and formatting to interpreting, interrogating, and problem solving, I think will attract key talent. And very selfishly and personally, I mean, I need to work somewhere that I'm proud of. So we've got to get the word out that mining has the smallest environmental footprint in the world with the largest economic benefit. Most people simply don't realize that. And then lastly, my last point was on thinking differently about the economics of exploration and how and where we invest. Critical minerals are bundled up with a whole bunch of other ones. To mine many of them, you need to mine copper, which is a key point of what we're talking about today. And we have to think about how we value our exploration projects to take this into consideration, because as Tommy highlighted, return on capital is at the heart of our business. And grade and tonnage is absolutely paramount. We need assets that are high quality and resilient in the face of cycles. Exploration spending, as we've already spoken about, has gone down, and a lot of it's been going into brownfields exploration, essentially resource extension work, which is very much lower risk work, as Tommy highlighted. And on the grassroots, the greenfield side, you know, press releases drive reporting of intercepts to sustain funding for juniors, and this doesn't promote quality on a focus on quality resources either. It's just about, you know, showing that you have some metal in your core. So industry's been cutting investment, as Tommy shared. Majors have been shifting away from grassroots exploration. So at BHP, for example, we started Explore. We wanted to find a way to collaborate and accelerate discovery by providing funding, expertise, and support to junior explorers, because they're doing a lot of the grassroots exploration right now, and we need a way and a vehicle to expedite their work. So we look to the world of venture capitalists and how the accelerator business has been used to invest in early stage technology opportunities, and we essentially re-engineered it for the mineral exploration industry. And for us, it's been a really innovative, it's early days, we're only on our second cohort, but it's been a really innovative investment vehicle for us that grows our networks, our relationships, and brings new growth options into our business. And through the program, we're setting some pretty exciting long-term relationships and effective partnerships. And for our partners, it's an innovative program that really fills a significant gap in what the market currently supports financially as it's currently structured. So thus far, it's been a win-win. So just a couple of thoughts there, Adam. Thanks for the opportunity to share them.
Wow, great. Thank you very much, Nicole. So let me jump to Dan, and just for the benefit of our audience, define a couple of terms that have been used already. When geologists refer to brownfields, that means we're talking about an ore deposit that we have already discovered. So we already know it exists, and we may be mining it, and we can increase the total quantity of copper that we can mine in some cases, not all. And then greenfields is when a geologist goes to a remote area that no one has ever set foot on. No one has ever looked in this particular remote area for a copper deposit. So Dan, one of the things I get asked a lot is, well, why can't mining companies just open up the spigot like we do if we're washing dishes or taking a shower? You know, if we want lots of water to come out, we simply turn the faucet open, and when we don't want water to come out, we turn the faucet closed. Mining companies are not like that. We know that mines don't have the ability to increase and decrease production instantaneously. So can you give us a sense of the challenges and opportunities? You know, when we hear a lot in the news about mining waste piles, mining tailings, there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding that we'll be able to meet the copper demand simply by mining the waste piles at existing mines. And I don't think that's the case, but can you educate us on that?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And I just wanted to extend our thanks to the IEF for their active role in discussing this criticality of copper, because we certainly agree this is an important topic. Secretary General, thank you for hosting this platform. And Professors Simon and Cathles, appreciate your focus in bringing this to everyone's attention, particularly from the academic perspective, because it does bring a different perspective on this. And it's nice to see the academic world getting engaged in this really important topic. As a leading producer of copper at Freeport-McMoRan, you know, we have seen over the last decade the change you've described. You know, historically, you could turn on that spigot. You could bottleneck your assets. You could bring on additional mine tons, and copper would flow to meet short-term demands, where you would see a change. And so you had a traditional cycle where you would have, you know, increase in demand. The industry would respond both by debottlenecking as well as turning on some new mines. New mines were readily available, particularly in this time in Latin America, where you could bring on new mines relatively quickly to meet that demand. Today, we see something very different, though. We call it the new era of demand. It's really driven by this energy transition that you've talked about. We all know the electric vehicles, the wind, the solar. Copper is critical for the electric transmission and distribution. And then artificial intelligence and the data centers are the new topic around. That's another demand driving all of this, and it flows nicely into what Nicole had mentioned around the data analytic work that we're doing, not only in exploration but in operations, and then of course more broadly used around the world for other data infrastructure. So whether you agree with analyst projections on demand, which are all bullish, whether you look to S&P Global's 2022 study that said you had to potentially double the amount of copper that we're currently producing today by 2035 in order to meet the net neutral ambitions that many governments have set for carbon reductions, or your study, which shows an even more dramatic demand profile potentially. These are all cases that Freeport we agree with. I mean, the demand is coming. We think this is going to drive the incentive price of copper up. The copper price is going to increase. And so there's going to be pressure on the industry to respond. There'll be a price that will drive that investment. But beyond just price, there are some fundamental challenges across the industry. And I'll talk about 5 of them briefly. The first is that these projects are taking, if committed today, the known resources that we have, between 5 to 8 years to develop, right? I mean, these aren't things that we can turn on quickly, even if they're known resources and we have feasibility studies for them. I do think that the quality of the assets was one key. The grade has decreased. We all know that the head grade has decreased, and so when you turn on more tons, you're creating less copper. And then we've mentioned before that we're turning to underground assets, which are potentially higher grade, could be lower grade, but they're certainly more costly to extract than open pit. They do have some advantages, but that's another challenge we face in the industry. Instability around the world in terms of consistency of rules and regulations. Whether we're turning to places outside of traditional mining jurisdictions to look for new copper deposits, and we may not find the same stability and predictability that we've had in the past. This is a major challenge for us as an industry, as we look to make billions of dollars of investments and look to recover that. That could take a decade, depending on what cycle you're in. And oftentimes what we're seeing is countries don't have the predictability that companies are looking for to make sure that we get the appropriate rate of return for our shareholders. And that's slowing down investment today, for certain. Other challenges that we see in the development world are the length of time for discovery to production. A lot of countries have put in place a number of years where you have to move from exploration discovery to production. And we all know that takes a long time. And it's appropriate to have time frames in place, because governments don't want just to sit on assets and not develop them. But oftentimes governments and the general community don't understand that it does take some time to develop, even if you're motivated to move forward quickly. It takes a lot of study and investment. That leads into a third point, in which is really on permitting. Freeport is actively engaged with the U.S. government as well as governments around the world that we operate in. President Borish at the CESCO Mining Conference this past couple of months mentioned, Chile's focus on trying to make permitting more efficient. So everyone recognizes this is a priority. This is not about lowering the environmental standards or the standards of which we have to operate by, but it's really about being more efficient, reducing the layers of review and appeal so that decisions can be made about investments. 2 more points, and one is really critically important. That's workforce. And as we modernize our mining operations, we're looking for data analytics. We're looking at autonomous vehicles and remote-driven vehicles to do our operations underground. And this requires a different workforce than we have today. And so we're collaborating with governments around the world and as industry partners to develop those workforce and the human resources we need to fit the new roles that are required to make modern mining successful. My final point on challenges is really around community engagement and support. This is critically important. You know, we as an industry require the community support, and oftentimes if you don't have community support, you know, you can't develop the resource that's available to us. At Freeport, we're blessed with most of our projects that are near term and midterm are in areas where we've been operating for decades. We often have multi-generational families that have been working at these mines, 3, 4, 5 generations of workers at the mines or service providers at the mines. And so the community support is there. Back to your definition, these are brownfield expansion opportunities that we have, but often quite large, you know, very large in size, could be, you know, tier 1 in size. And those opportunities will come with the right economic incentives for us to develop those opportunities. But again, taking time for permitting and doing all of the studies. But the community support is critically important. The industry's focused on it, and we look to that as an important factor. Let me wrap up, because Professor Cathels did say one thing about Freeport's leaching initiatives, and I'd like to give some color on it. It is a bright spot in the future. We have targeted 800 million pounds of production, so approximately, you know, well over 400,000 tons of production a year on an annual basis going forward for this initiative. So this is a tier 1 mine out of existing stockpiles that we have. They've already been mined, been sitting there for decades, and these are material that we have. We would calculate, and we started calculating in 2011. So we calculate there's about 40 billion pounds plus of copper contained in these stockpiles. So a lot to be extracted, but they were deemed unrecoverable by traditional mining methods. So we're looking at new ways to extract this copper. We've set a goal of this 800 million pounds. Our first initiative was to prove out the concept, and we've done that. We're at an annual run rate right now of 200 million pounds. You know, that's now we're moving into the next phase, which will double that amount to 400 million pounds over the near term. And that's really focused on precision operating techniques, data analytics, and leaching everywhere. The final phase of this is moving from 400 million pounds to 800 million pounds, which will again double the amount that we're extracting from these previously thought to be unrecoverable copper. Is really related to new innovations and techniques, looking at heat in different ways than we've ever done before, looking at additives, working with partners around the industry to develop new ways of extraction. So we're very bullish, we're very confident about this. This will not solve the supply gap, but it's going to be an incredible added point of copper production that will be both beneficial for us from a low cost perspective, low carbon footprint, since it's already mined. It only needs the solvent extraction system and electrowinning to process the copper. So very, very low carbon and less water intensive. So there's a lot of benefits to this material.
Well, that's great, Dan.
Yeah, let me close it down and just say the future is bright for copper. You know, we're committed at Freeport to being a responsible producer and glad to play an important role in reducing the energy and low carbon future for the global economy. So thanks for the opportunity to speak today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. Okay, so one of the things that we all have a good understanding of is that there are a lot of people involved in the mining life cycle. We have geologists who do the exploration for mineral deposits. Once we identify a mineral deposit, we bring people in on the business and finance side to make the determination as to whether or not this copper deposit can be mined and can be mined for a profit, which drives the business world. We then bring in mining engineers who design a mine, and they tell us how much we can mine per year for a given mine lifetime. And then we bring in people like Saskia, who have really strong backgrounds, bachelor's, master's, and PhD in material science and metallurgical processing and engineering, who figure out how we take a rock out of the ground, that contains 99.5% stuff we don't want. And they can strategically pull out only the copper and other metals that we need. And so, Saskia, I'd like to open up and get your thoughts on, what are the challenges that we face in the world of processing? And can you also comment on something Nicole brought up, which is the importance of mining copper to get other metals, which otherwise we would not mine because they're not economic by themselves?
Thanks, Adam. And yeah, a topic very, very close to my heart and my background of processing. And so really glad to be able to talk with everybody about it today. But one of the things I do want to thank Adam and Larry both for putting this paper together, really focusing on supply. I mean, we hear a lot about demand, what we see the market, what that's going to look like, but this focus on really thinking about supply, because I think it's one of the challenges that we faced from government, from communities. People don't understand mining and the complexity that it's involved, and you flagged it very well. All those stages that go into what it really takes to find a mine, let alone run a mine, and produce copper. And so I think as we continue to focus and help people understand, because we really need to think about all these aspects, right? And as we said, we need to bring one, discover, let alone bring one LTNT mine on every year, means we also need to have the processing capacity to support what a mine like that looks like. And so these are some of the in the same production rates that we had. And so this is one of the challenges.
We lost you for about 20 seconds, if you can back up.
I'm sorry. I have a very unstable network at home, surprisingly, even though I'm in Salt Lake City. So I'm not sure where I back up. I'll back up to that things are getting harder. The ores are getting harder. We have lower grades, right? We have more complex to think about how we process them, mine them and process them is really requiring us to think differently about it, right? And it's what Nicole said, a bit of a do differently, right? Because literally we have to process more ore for the same to produce the same copper than we did before. So what does that mean from a technology standpoint? But let's first talk about what it means from a capital standpoint. About the money invested from an exploration standpoint. We haven't invested similarly in technology development, right? To be able to run these types of systems that now require more ore is going to be more capital intense. It's going to require more energy. So what can we do differently? There's quite a bit of work happening out there in terms of how do we it longer. The scale ups are a bit harder. And so this is one of...
We lost you again, and I'm just going to suggest maybe if you kill your video.
Sure. There we go. Hopefully that will keep me on and I'm a little bit better. Yep.
Go for it.
Okay. So now I don't know where I ended up. So I'll maybe talk a little bit around the capital involved with processing, right? As we go to these lower grade ores, we require more capital. We require larger systems. So again, this is another challenge when we've been talking about what it looks like from an exploration standpoint. Now we need to now find the tier ones that have to have the quality, But if they don't, we have now the more intensive capital required for some of these new processing plants. So it is really important that we start to look at what are some of the new technology options, right? And Dan did a great job talking about the leaching from Freeport. Rio Tinto has similar technology that we look at called Newton, where again, this is the point. Each of the companies are looking at their own technologies. How can we think about where does it make sense for us to collaborate on these kinds of technologies? Where do we see that there's benefits for our particular deposits? Because I think the key thing is that none of these deposits are exactly the same. So there isn't going to be the silver bullet, or I like to call it the copper bullet, that's going to fix everything. And so this is a key piece that we need to keep having people think about. There isn't a single technology that is going to fix this. We need to keep thinking differently. We need to keep exploring these kinds of technologies, but the runways to deliver these are long, right? They're long lead times. How do you actually bring to scale? What does it look like in, as you well explained, a brownfield, right? An
Saskia, we lost you after the word brownfields.
Okay. I'm sorry. I really don't know what to do. I'm on, yeah. Apologies. Life happens, right? So in terms of complexities, right? We're trying to produce the copper that we need every day. And how do we trial new technologies? So these are all things that there's a lot of work happening, in particular in the US, in Australia, on how do we develop these test beds? How can we scale up this technology? Because this all becomes a key part of it. So, but this may be all a bit negative. I'm going to switch on to the bright side of it, right? The funny thing is, with these ores becoming more complex, guess what? They're actually a blessing in disguise, because with those come all these critical minerals that we were talking about that come with copper. It's one of the best things about copper porphyry. They come with a whole smorgasbord of critical and strategic minerals that become an opportunity for us to think about. Now, in some cases, things like you look at tellurium, where 90% of world tellurium production comes as a co-product of copper. You don't mine tellurium, you mine copper and you get tellurium as a byproduct. So thinking about that from that perspective can really change the critical mineral landscape. On the other hand, you do have some critical minerals, things like PGMs or bismuth, that may be at lower volumes, but as Dan flagged too, from a carbon footprint perspective, once you've mined the copper, then for a relatively low increase in footprint, carbon, energy, we can actually recover even small volumes of these critical minerals. And so it's really this perspective of thinking about a full value mining approach.
Full value mining approach.
We want people to think about, because again, the key part of this is don't just think about the copper. There's the critical minerals. What is there any existing value in tailings from building materials? But how do we make sure we squeeze every last value out of our ore? That's one of the key things that we see is for the future. And this is only going to happen with a partnership. It's going to be partnerships between mining companies, like what we've done between BHP and Rio Tinto for developing new tailings technology. It's going to be with joint venture companies. It's going to be with universities, but it takes a true ecosystem to address all of this. And I'll call it there since I keep fading in and out.
That's great, Saskia. Thank you very much. So, Frank, I'll turn to you, and what I'd like to have you do is to comment on what I hear frequently, which is, well, can't we just substitute something else for copper? And as we describe and discuss in our report, copper is the most fundamental metal for energy writ large. We need and use copper to produce electricity. We need and use copper to deliver electricity to batteries. So copper is really fundamental. We hear a lot in the news about various types of lithium-ion batteries, more nickel, less manganese, less cobalt. We hear about salt batteries. But it seems to me that no matter what the battery chemistry is, whatever the cathode may be, we still need copper. So can you talk with us about what substitution has the potential to do and not to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I'd like to thank IEF for having me. Adam, Larry, your work on this study. Over the last few years in particular, I think there's been a lot of great work done on speaking about the challenges on the mineral side associated with the energy transition. And I think this is another the latest and greatest in that. To very quickly answer the question, I don't believe that there is going to be a notable uptick in substitution away from copper, say towards aluminum. Now, to take a step back, as we look at the landscape, Adam, Larry's work, some of the work we've done at S&P and just others over the last 3-5 years or so, there's, I think, a credible long-term bullish demand story for copper. As you look at the energy transition and technologies that will eventually materially lower emissions, say renewables, electric vehicles, these all have very different supply chains and use different and material compositions than our conventional energy systems and internal combustion engine vehicles. They're a lot more minerals based, and they use a lot more copper. And so as we think about the future, there's I think a strong argument for a material increase in demand, and we've highlighted some of the challenges in getting supply online to meet some of these demand ambitions. So to a casual observer, they might hear this, see this, and think, well, wouldn't that drive some fairly strong increases in pricing that would lead to substitution towards other minerals or materials? And it really isn't so obvious that that would be the case. There's a couple of reasons for that. First, as we look at different applications and uses. So, there will be some efficiency gains in technologies that'll always occur, and there will be a degree of material substitution over time, just as there has been in the past. But for the large part, a lot of where material substitution away from copper towards, say, aluminum, where that makes sense, has already happened. For example, you think about overhead cables, particularly in the transmission and distribution sector. A lot of that's already occurred. We expect there will be some additional substitution there, but we expect that to start to taper off. But there are applications where you just can't substitute copper. For instance, subsea cabling, the harness within an electric vehicle. You think about copper is the only material that is as good of a conductor of electricity as copper is silver. And we're not going to see an uptick in substitution of copper towards silver. And if there is, it's going to be very minimal. The second thing is we think about this empirically. So looking at data over the long term back to the 50s, 60s, when looking at the relationship between copper and aluminum prices, we tend to see more material substitution of copper towards aluminum when that ratio of copper to aluminum prices exceeds the 3.5 to 4 range for an extended period of time. As a reference for where prices are right now, we're in that range, but towards the high end, around 3.8, 3.9, using data from last week. Looking back over the last 10 years or so, we crossed that 4.0 ratio in 2021 for a few months when there was what we called the everything rally in commodity prices. But for the large part, we've stayed within that range. Now, as we look ahead to the future, there, will there be some increases in copper pricing? That absolutely could happen. And I think, frankly, to Tommy, your point, it needs to happen to create that incentive pricing to bring more supply online. But what I think is really important is thinking about this all in relative terms and not in a vacuum. Because even though we may be talking about copper right now, copper is not the only mineral that is going to see demand increases over the coming years, coming decades. The battery metals that you hear about all the time, lithium, cobalt, nickel, those are going to see big increases in demand as well. Manganese, a slew of other minerals, including aluminum. So as copper, and in particular for aluminum, given its lightweight properties, and given the weight of EV batteries, there's a strong case for aluminum being used even more in the mobility sector to cut down on weight. But as we look ahead, it isn't clear to me that this increase in copper demand over the future will necessarily cause a change in that relationship in pricing that really leads to more material substitution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frank. So I appreciate the comments from each of you. And with the time we have left, I'd like to ask a question, and I'll let one of you take first crack at an answer, which is that if you could invite to dinner the world's policymakers, and we think about policy in the United States is 4% of the world's population, and we consume 16% of the world's energy. So a lot of people think that if the energy transition can happen in the United States, that would serve as a really good roadmap for implementing it elsewhere. If you could invite to dinner the world's policymakers in Washington, in Ottawa, in Santiago, in Brussels, what would you ask them to do to help your companies meet the demand for the policies that they have enacted?
Adam, I'll just reiterate our view at Freeport is the policymakers should be focused on, particularly if they want to support critical minerals, critical resources such as copper, two things. One is permitting efficiency, as I've talked about. We've got to be able to cut down the timeline, not reduce the environmental and social and other regulatory demands on the mining industry, but reduce the timeline and have predictability and less layers of review in that permitting process. That's absolutely critical. And then work with us on workforce. There's some places around the world where workforce is entirely abundant, and other places where we have more challenges, particularly in the US. But no matter where we work, we need to start thinking about right now modernizing the workforce.
So, you bring that up, and I'm reminded of conversations with my father, who was a chemistry major in the early 1960s. And he describes watching a speech by John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy at the time, who famously said, "We're going to put a human on the moon by the end of the decade." And my father said that everyone he knew in the sciences and engineering got really excited about that. And they viewed it as an all hands on deck. Let's figure out what we need to do to physically put humans in a little tiny spaceship and have them fly 250,000 miles away from Earth, not only land on the moon, but then come back safely. And we figured that out. And several of you have brought up workforce. So what could policymakers do to encourage the growth of a suitably trained workforce? Nicole, I see you want to answer. So who is it that you need that we produce from universities? And how can policymakers help?
I think this touches on both of your questions, in all honesty. It's your moonshot's a great example, right? And I mean, I think the panel has done a great job of highlighting that. I think people are seeing the demand, but they're seeing the demand problem, they're not seeing the supply problem. And of course, from my side, I spoke very technically about what the Earth actually has to offer in that space. So the scale of the challenge, the awareness of that, and your report does such a great job, because when you talk about a moonshot and everything you just described, it's easy as a layperson who's never tried to get to the moon to go, wow, that seems real hard. Yeah, I'll do what I can to support that, right? And similarly, so that awareness piece is so big, and then that's so tied to our talent challenge and our labor challenge, because it's all around turning around that perception. We aren't the problem. We actually are such a key unlocker to the solution here. And I think that will help unlock access to ground that we spoke about, funding, certain funding starting to get locked up if you have association with certain industries, talent, and of course, we've got mines waiting to go that will help support the supply that we've been chatting about. But it is all around that perception of mining and what we're actually contributing to this challenge. So awareness of the challenge, and then the fact that we're here to unlock it. We're not here to make it harder. We're here to unlock that moonshot. And by the way, we need you, everybody on this call and everybody on this webinar, to help us out and get engaged and passionate about it as much as we are. Would be a incredibly important start.
Yeah, I'll just follow on from Nicole on that point. Like people, you know, mining is a long-term game, and you know, where we are in the UK, I mean, we're just a stone's throw from the Royal School of Mines here in South Kensington. You know, the Royal School of Mines used to be a much bigger faculty, offering many more courses, and there's also the Camborne School of Mines, again a sort of a slight shadow of their former selves, but that's not necessarily the case throughout the world. But the important thing is, and I think one of the reasons for the sort of reduction in the size of intake at these universities, because this is where it all starts, right? You know, it is the grassroots of education which are incredibly important. And often these courses are correlated to the commodity index. When prices are high, there's a lot of interest for these courses, and you know, and then as prices decline, there's less interest, and also mining companies, like the many companies on this call, as well as the various investment banks, etc., and consultants and advisors, etc., that it is up to us as an industry to be more supportive of these faculties and have more structured hiring out of these faculties. I appreciate it is hard to fit people in a business where you've got volatility, but you know, where I did my master's, there were a couple of mining companies who were very good throughout the cycles, very good at taking structured intakes, but the rest of the industry came and went as the commodity price went. And so it's very important for us to think about this as a long-term business, as we think about our deposits in a long-term way. You know, the human capital is equally as important, and we need to invest in that throughout the cycle. So that's my first point. The second point is, what would governments do to to from a policy perspective to support this industry, I think a lot of it, again, talking of grassroots, comes down to exploration. Encouraging exploration, providing tax incentives for projects as they develop, to reward the risk, the incredible risk that goes into the mining industry. And I almost feel as though it's the junior mining industry that does, that has done the lion's share of the growth exploration for this industry over the last decade. So obviously there are a couple of the mining companies who are consistent, but most of the industry has not had a growth mindset for the past decade. And it is important that there are incentives to tax breaks, grants, you name it, to throw at exploration. And exploration is not a guaranteed business. As we've talked about on this in this discussion, that you may find something, it may not necessarily be commercial. There will be projects that will show promise but will not necessarily deliver, for the various risks that there exist in this industry. But we need to give places we need to give companies and people a shot. And those are the two things. One of them is industry. It is our responsibility to bring up the people, and the other thing is also to encourage the exploration. And policy helps, but also mining companies help as well.
Well, as an academic, I welcome support. I'm ready and able and willing to take it. But I see Larry has his hand up, so I want to let Larry jump in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. I think one thing that can be done, perhaps from the academic side, but I think it's good for you guys to do it too, is to point out that there is incredible scientific value to the mining process. If you look at it from a physics point of view, it's sort of Le Chatelier's principle. Big processes create little sub-processes. If you want a big mine, you're dealing with a big process. Big processes count in understanding Earth histories. Little Earth processes do not. So I've been trying to convince my colleagues, unsuccessfully, I might say, for years, that there's a huge amount of very, very valuable data in ore deposits, and it's all collected for you. It's all paid for. The rocks are there. All you need to do is go to the industry and ask, and you can have tremendous collaboration. And I'd like to just say one more example of that. Another area that I'm involved in, have been involved for a long time, is the fluid properties of the Earth as a whole. And what is coming around now is increasingly the perception that the asthenosphere is critical, not only for plate tectonics and other things, but the asthenosphere is supported by volatile circulation. So in other words, the subduction zones bring down water into the mantle. It interacts and it causes volcanism and other things. Now that is the kind of process that can produce ore deposits. And I think we're increasingly, my perception is that increasingly we're perceiving that the really big deposits of gold and copper and whatnot start out at the asthenosphere lithosphere boundary, with melts and volatiles coming out of the mantle, including CO2. I think that's a very interesting area to pursue. It is not one that many people are aware of, but I think it's got tremendous potential. And it might be a thought for you guys to think a little bit about that and then try to support somehow, some work in that area, particularly looking at the data that you've already got. And I think that would draw people into the profession. I mean, I came into mining as a physicist, basically. I knew nothing about it. I took a trip to the Michigan Peninsula and one of our former faculty members to give me a short course on mining so I wouldn't appear too stupid when I went to work for Kennecott. So you can bring people in. It does happen. It sometimes works out all right.
So let's hear from Frank, and then we'll close this out.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one kind of quick thing on that and then actually turn it back to you, Adam. So, kind of my perspective on, one challenge that could be driving this is perhaps the policy approach to all this. And in some senses, it seems almost backward. First you kind of saw this approach of what should be the timeline of decarbonization. You kind of get there's the 2050 number, there's others as well. Then you say, okay, from now you set this timeline, how do we get there on a technology basis? Then you can kind of look at what's available, what would be the impact, and draw a little bit of a playbook there. And then a lot of the policies then have been towards simulating demand for those very downstream end markets. And obviously, what's clear to all of us, but maybe not so broadly, is that you really need to start upstream at the raw material level. Because if you don't figure out the mining piece, you're not going to get, say, the investment or incentive pricing or a surety to unlock the processing or even some of the downstream fabrication that gets you all the way back, somewhere along that way as well. In parts, really each step is also the labor piece as well. So I think we're starting to work our way backwards. And as we get back to the raw material level, then I think maybe that should help a bit and you'll start to see a bit more support. But Adam, I also just want to turn that around to you. Larry, I know you just touched on this, but your perspective from academia, what are some of the things you're seeing? Are you seeing any an increase or a decrease in just interest in mining from students?
I think what we're seeing is a lot of inertia in academia on the part of faculty and administrators. We are seeing a lot of increased interest among students. If we go backwards only a few decades, every Ivy League school and Stanford and Duke and Caltech, they had one of us on their faculty. And most of those schools had multiple geology faculty. And what we've done over the last few decades is we've seen a systematic year-over-year decline in what I think of as traditional geology in academia, and year-over-year increase in the number of faculty who focus exclusively on climate change. And what I do in my classes is I communicate to students that we get it. If we understand how climate changes, and we today know very well how to distinguish natural climate change from anthropogenic or human-caused climate change, we get it. And what students are able to grasp very quickly is, so what are the solutions? And in the classes I teach at the University of Michigan, I've gotten pretty good at reading body language to know if students lean left or lean right. And what I found is that all of the students can agree on a common set of solutions to reduce our human impact on climate, but it's the faculty and the administrators and the policymakers for whom there's a lot more inertia. They're very resistant to, okay, let's just jump in and let's figure out how we do this, because that would mean fewer faculty devoted exclusively to studying climate change. So I think what we've seen is the pendulum completely swung, and we now need to move it back somewhere in the center. And we're slow to do that. If I just make one final comment, in the United States, all of us are aware of what now are likely to be trillions of dollars in tax credits and direct loans for the downstream manufacture of renewable energy. right? We're building warehouses at an incredibly rapid rate to build new batteries, although we can't build them without the expertise from other countries. And what we're not seeing is, to your point, the upstream supply of all of the raw materials. So it's as if we're investing in baking the cake, but the grocery store shelves are empty. You can't bake the cake unless you can go to a grocery store and you can procure all of the ingredients. And for the energy transition, copper is the most important. We can do away with lithium. We can do away with nickel. We can do away with cobalt. Seriously, we can completely re-engineer batteries over the next couple of decades to eliminate concerns about child labor in cobalt mines. We cannot engineer our way past copper. And so this is a message that I certainly try and deliver to the students I engage with. And I can tell you they're excited, no matter what their background is. The engineering majors are excited, the economist and business majors are excited, the environmental science majors are excited, but we're not doing a good enough job at changing the curricula in universities that we need. And with that, I want to turn it back over to the Secretary General to close us out. And again, thank all of our panelists. We encourage all of our listeners to read the report. As Larry indicated, all of our methods are available. They're all built as macros in Microsoft Excel, and you can download that and you can go through and you can double check every one of our numbers, and we encourage you to do that. And we also encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or comments. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to the Secretary General.
Well, thanks very much, Adam. And again, thanks to you and Larry for your work on preparing this report. And thank you to our panelists for a really fascinating discussion. And I hope we're moving the needle in expanding the appreciation for this upstream component that was highlighted. As I say many times regarding oil and gas and hydrocarbons, we need to manage the transition. This idea that we can force the transition is really a misguided approach. And I say this because essentially what we've been trying to do over the last 10 to 15 years is reduce supplies of hydrocarbons as a way to get to our climate goals. And all that is doing is increasing prices of hydrocarbons and creating a lot of volatility. And I'm worried about that because what that does is it really undermines public support for the transition. Because if the public starts to connect high prices and volatility with transition policies or climate progress, we're in real trouble. I don't think you get another chance at getting them to support the transition. And I think we have similar issues with copper supply. There's another organization that's pointing out under today's policy settings, we're going to see dramatic growth in EVs. And again, these are governments that are setting policies for EV growth, but what they're not doing under today's policy settings, there's no incentivizing or support for new copper mines. And I get that price signals are an important component to this, but as was pointed out several times during the discussion, it takes 20 years to build a new copper mine. And, one example in Germany and in other EU countries, for importing LNG and regasification of LNG, those terminals, there was a public comment period and all these different regulatory hurdles that took about 10 years, and it was condensed into a year. And this is in places like Germany. And so I think you need to see a similar effort here. As was pointed out, we've got mines ready to go. But if government policies are preventing us from bringing these new mines and copper supply online, I think it's going to be very hard to meet these 2035 or 2050 100% EV targets. So with that, I'll just echo what Adam said. I encourage everybody to download the report, go to the website. There are other resources there. Of course, all the bios for our panelists as well. And we'll probably be doing more on this topic as the year progresses. And I invite you to follow us on the IF website and all of our social media handles as well. So with that, I'll end the discussion. Good night, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you're joining us. And again, thank you again to the panelists and to Professors Adam and Larry. And thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you again to everybody watching online. This is Tom Ashby signing off from the headquarters of the International Energy Forum in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Goodbye.